Welcome once again at Customs GST Advisory channel of customsgst.com. Please subscribe the channel before we start our journey on this topic. Here is a deceptively simple GST question. Does obtaining a GST registration itself make a person liable to pay GST? Or is it the other way around that GST liability already exists and registration merely follows? This distinction is not academic. It can determine whether a demand for GST is legally sustainable. Today, let us separate three concepts that are frequently mixed together: taxability, liability to pay tax, and liability to obtain registration. To start with the most important proposition, GST registration is generally not the source of GST tax liability. The starting point is the taxable supply. Under Section 7 of the CGST Act, we first ask whether there is a supply, then we examine Section 9 and the applicable charging mechanism. Only after establishing the substantive tax liability do we ask whether the person is required to obtain registration. So the conceptual sequence is not registration then GST liability. It is generally supply then taxability, tax liability then registration obligation. Of course, the GST legislation contains important exceptions and special mechanisms which we will examine. Why is this distinction important? Because a GSTIN or registration number is not a charging provision. Section 9 of the CGST Act is the principal charging provision for intrastate supplies subject of cost to the statutory framework. The existence of a GST registration does not answer the fundamental question: why is tax payable? The department must identify the taxable supply and the legal provision under which tax is imposed. F. Proposition: you are registered, therefore GST is payable, is legally incomplete. The correct question is: what is the taxable supply? What is the applicable charging provision? Who is liable to pay the tax and at what rate? Consider Sections 22 and 24 of the CGST Act. Section 22 generally links registration with the statutory conditions and turnover thresholds. Section 24 identifies specified categories of persons who are required to register compulsorily irrespective of the normal threshold framework subject to the statutory provisions and exceptions. This demonstrates an important legislative architecture. Registration is principally a compliance gateway into the GST system. It tells us who must enter the registered person framework, but registration does not by itself manufacture a taxable supply when none exists. It is perhaps the strongest statutory evidence. GST law itself recognizes that a person may be liable to tax even though he has not obtained registration. Section 63 provides for assessment of an unregistered person who, in the opinion of the proper officer, is liable to pay tax but has failed to obtain registration. Think carefully about what this means. If registration were the source of tax liability, an unregistered person could never have a tax liability. But Section 63 expressly contemplates the opposite. Therefore, no registration does not necessarily mean no GST liability. Section 29 provides another important indication. Cancellation of registration does not erase the person's liability for tax and other dues for the period preceding cancellation. Again, this tells us something fundamental. Registration and tax liability are legally connected, but they are not identical. Registration may begin or end, but the substantive liability for a taxable transaction does not disappear merely because the registration status later changes. Now comes the subtle part. What about voluntary registration? Section 25(3) permits a person who is not otherwise liable to register to obtain registration voluntarily, and once such registration is obtained, the statutory consequences applicable to a registered person can follow. So can we then say that registration creates tax liability? Although we must not go to the opposite extreme. There are GST provisions where registered person status itself is legally relevant. For example, provisions dealing with input tax credit, tax invoices, certain schemes and exemptions may expressly depend upon the person being registered. In those situations, registration is not merely administrative. It becomes a constituent condition for a particular statutory consequence. So we need to distinguish between two propositions. First, registration does not ordinarily create the underlying taxable supply or the basic charging liability. Second, once registration exists, certain statutory rights, obligations, restrictions, or consequences may become applicable precisely because the person is registered. Let us convert this into a practical litigation test. When the department issues a GST demand merely because the taxpayer is registered, ask 5 questions. Question number 1, what is the supply? Question number 2, why is that supply taxable under Section 7? Question number 3, what is the charging provision imposing the tax? Question number 4, who is statutorily liable to pay it? And question number 5, what role does registration action play in this particular liability? If these questions cannot be answered independently, merely pointing to the GSTIN is not enough. Let us take a simple hypothetical example. Suppose a person makes a supply that is genuinely exempt under the applicable GST notification. Now assume that person happens to possess a GST registration. Can the department simply say, "You are registered, therefore you must pay GST on this supply"? No, the department must first establish why the particular supply is taxable. Registration cannot merely by itself override the statutory exemption. Conversely, suppose a person makes a taxable supply and is liable to tax but fails to register. Can the department say there is no tax because there is no GSTIN? Again, no, the law can determine and recover tax liability even from an unregistered person. What is the precise legal formula? Here it is. Taxability is determined by the substantive provisions governing supply, levy, and exemption. Registration is determined by the statutory provisions governing who must enter the GST registration framework. And in certain provisions, registered status itself becomes a constituent condition for a particular statutory consequence. Therefore, we should never mechanically equate GSTIN is equal to GST. Liability. The correct equation is more sophisticated. Taxable supply plus applicable charging provision plus person liable plus rate is equal to tax liability. Registration is a separate statutory question, although it can interact with that liability in specified circumstances. Does GST registration create tax liability? The short answer is ordinarily no. Tax liability arises from the substantive charging architecture of GST. Registration ordinarily follows from statutory conditions relating to the person and his activities. But there is an important qualification. Where the law makes registered status a constituent condition for a particular right, obligation, exemption, restriction, or statutory consequence, registration can become legally decisive. That is why the real GST question is not, does he have a GSTIN? It is, what provision of law makes this transaction taxable? And that is a much more powerful question in GST litigation. Remember these three propositions. First, taxability is not created merely by registration. Second, absence of registration does not necessarily eliminate tax liability. Third, registration can nevertheless become legally significant wherever the statute makes registered status a constituent condition. That distinction between taxability, tax liability, and registration liability is one of the most important conceptual foundations for analyzing GST disputes. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to Customs GST Advisory channel for more deep dive analysis of GST and customs law.